Okay, hello everybody. Can you give me a thumbs up if you can hear me? Because I have no feedback here at all. Awesome, thank you. Great to see so many people here today. Now, I'm going to give you a bit of a warning before I start. This is a little bit shortened from the normal length I do this talk, so I'm going to be speaking just a little bit quickly. If you're watching this back on YouTube, 0.75 would probably be good. All right, back in 2020, I was giving a talk at Azure Live, and an hour before I was due to go on stage for a talk about static web apps, it's my favorite thing, another speaker came up to me and said, static web apps, they're fun, but they're just toys. You can't do anything with them, can you? And well, I'm going to be honest with you, that's not the type of thing to say to a speaker an hour before they do their talk. It annoyed me just a little bit. But it also triggered me. These are not just toys. We can do things with them. I'm going to write a talk to prove you wrong. And that basically is how this talk got started. Now, what we're going to do in the next 25 minutes is set up 3 pipelines so that we can do Azure Static Web Apps with infrastructure as code, set a custom domain, and then deploy our application in our own pipelines using the AZ Static Web App command and the Static Web Apps CLI. So something we can use every day in a more enterprise environment. And with that, my introduction, that's always a good one, isn't it? Hi, I'm Stacy Cashmore. I'm Tech Explorer DevOps at Omniplan, based here in Amsterdam. We make financial software. I have been developing software since the mid-1990s, and I feel older every time I say that. And since 2020, I have had the honor, and I still can't believe I get to say it, of being able to call myself a Microsoft MVP in developer technologies. And with that, I'm out of slides. Now we can get gone to some code, and we can start creating our pipelines. So I have a repo here with a simple to-do app set up, ready to be deployed. And what we're going to do is write 3 pipelines, like I say, one for the infrastructure, one for a custom domain, and one to do the deploy. And we want to do everything that that hobby out-of-the-box deploy pipeline gives to us. So that default pipeline, what does it do? It builds our application, it builds our front end, our back end, it guesses what language we're using. It's quite a cool piece of kit. It then deploys it to Azure, and it tells Azure what type of Azure functions it needs to configure in order to run my application. So our 3 pipelines have to kind of encapsulate that. On top of this, the other thing that it does is if you make a pull request, it will make you a staging environment. And then just as important as making a staging environment, when you close your pull request, it will clean it up. Super important for 2 reasons. One is general housekeeping. Of course, you should clean up after yourself. And 2, because an Azure Static Web App has a limited amount of staging environments. 2 for the free tier, 5 for the standard tier that you pay for. So let's get started on our first pipeline. So first thing that I need to do is take my glasses off so I can see my screen. It's always wonderful. I need glasses to see you. You're kind of a bit blurry now, but unfortunately, I need to see my screen as well. So we're going to make a pipeline. So the first thing we need in our repo, I'm just inside of a GitHub code space here. And we want a new folder, .github workflows. For those who don't know, if you stick a YAML file inside of this directory, GitHub will show you a workflow that you can then run, or will be triggered based on whatever actions you've specified. Then we're going to make our first workflow here. So we want a new file. Going to call that infrastructure as code. I haven't called this .yaml yet because Visual Studio Code is really annoying. And if you try and paste snippets in, it tries to guess at the formatting, and it guesses completely and utterly wrong. So we're going to rename it at the end when it's a little bit easier for us. Now, I do have snippets because in, 20 minutes, we've got 3 pipelines to do, and I know I'm going to do errors if I start to type. So, but I am going to explain what we do as we go forward. So the first snippet for our first pipeline, create and set up static web app infrastructure. We're putting this on a workflow dispatch. This is going to be a manual trigger because we're not going to be running this very often. We certainly don't want to run it every time we make a change to our repo. We're only going to want to run this when we set up our environment or if we have to make changes to it. Then we just have 3 variables that we need to run our pipeline, and that is what is the resource group going to be called, What is our static web app going to be called inside of that resource group? Interesting one here, and like an app service, a static web app doesn't have to have a unique name inside of Azure. It only has to be unique inside of your resource group. There's a downside to that, but we'll get to that in the next pipeline. And lastly, what region we want to run it in. We're running in West Europe, and as long as Twan hasn't created 500 static web apps at lunch, hopefully this should work for us. First thing that we need to do then is get our code, and we're going to log into Azure because we're going to be using the AZ command line for our workflow. I am using a bad way of logging into Azure here, but it's really easy to set up for a demo. Please don't do this in your production environment. Do it properly. It's outside of the scope of this, but just be aware. And then we need to do the actual work. First thing, we need a bicep file, because we're going to be creating our Azure Static Web App with bicep. So let's make a new file here. Main.bicep, and inside of here, I have the simplest possible bicep that you can use in order to create an Azure Static Web App. We are setting, yes, I know it's bicep, but you don't need to do anything. We're setting the location. We can either pass that in, or we can use the location of the resource group. The name you have to pass in. And then the SKU that we want to use, I'm defaulting it to free. To be honest, if you're in this process, you're going to probably be wanting to use a paid version, but for a demo, free is always good. Then we're using this Microsoft.web static sites, and there's only 3 things you need to set in order to create the most basic static web app. That is the name, the location, and the SKU that you're using. Now, you can set up a lot more than this inside of this bicep file, but for the purposes of time constraints, we're just going to leave it at this today. So now we have our bicep file, we can go back to our pipeline, and we can actually call the code that's going to set up our static web app. So if we bring it right back to here, we are going to be using, like I say, the Azure CLI, and we're going to be using AZ group create to make our resource group. We are then going to be deploying that bicep file using the AZ deployment. That's going to create our application for us. And in my 60-minute version of this talk, I also do custom authentication, and I show it working. And for that, I need a connection to a Cosmos DB database. These connections are in my configuration of my static web app. You can do that in the pipeline as well. So here you can see I'm accessing my static web app inside of my resource group, and I'm setting my Cosmos endpoint and my Cosmos key from my secrets in my organization. And I'm setting the container and the database name from the variables in my organization. If you are going to set these variables, do them in one call, because this is not a fast call. But if you set 4 different settings, it's just as fast as setting 1. So don't do multiple calls to set different things. Use it as little as you can. With that in place, I am going to try and remember to rename my file back to YAML, because that would be really useful. And we're going to push that up, and we're going to kick that off. So add IAC. Commit and sync. Keep our fingers crossed. If I refresh my repo now, we should hopefully see that we have a workflow. And if we go to actions, we have this create and set up SWA infrastructure. And because it's a manual one, we can kick that off. We can keep our fingers crossed. I've not done something stupid in the formatting, and it's actually going to work. Please? Anytime now? Well, that looks like it's running, so we'll let that one go. Generally takes about 2 to 3 minutes to run. Obviously, we're not going to sit and watch it. We're going to move on to the next step whilst we wait, and we're going to create our custom domain. So why do we need a custom domain? Well, I said at the start, you don't need a unique name for a static web app. The nice one is, naming conventions, you are in full control now. You don't have to avoid collisions with other people. Bad side is, that name in your app service is also part of your URL. That's not the case for a static web app. You get a random URL out of the box, and it's not nice to look at, it's not nice to use, it's not nice to remember, and you probably don't want it spread around different pipelines either. You're probably going to want to make it something that fits in your organization. So we're going to make a second pipeline, and we're going to call this custom domain. So where are we? In my workflows, new file. custom domain, we're still going to miss off the YAML at the end. And the start of the pipeline looks incredibly similar. We have a name, workflow dispatch. We're going to run this one manually again, and probably even less than we're running the IAC file, because you only need to do this one if you are adding or changing a custom domain. And then we log into Azure again. Next thing that we need to do is get access to our static web app and then create the custom domain. We don't know what that URL is. It's completely random, and we've just ran it inside of a pipeline. So we need to get this out of our static web app. And we use that using the AZ Static Web App Environment command. We're going to list them, and we're going to look in that list for the default host name. That will always be your production environment. We're going to echo that to the log file, and then we're going to make it available for a different job. The next one, I need to set up a DNS name. Now, I'm only going to do a subdomain here. So what I need to do is set a CNAME with the host name pointing at the subdomain that I want to do in my DNS records. I've written I am not showing you the code because it's awful. And I've wrote a little utility here which will just update my DNS records in my provider. Not going into it because all providers are different, but all it's doing is setting a CNAME. And finally, inside the AZ Static Web App host name, we can now set a host name, and we just point it to that subdomain. Depending on how fast or slow the DNS propagation is, this can work instantly, or it might work in 2 days' time. Unfortunately, there's not much we can do about that, so please, everybody, just keep your fingers crossed that it goes quickly. I'm going to push this up, and then we'll have a quick check about Apex domains before we actually deploy our application. Let's try and remember to rename this one to YAML as well. That's not bad. I'm 2 for 2. That means I'm going to forget the YAML in the next one. So if I do, somebody shout at me, please. And let's push this one up. Add custom domain. Commit and push. So hey, look, that's deployed. We're not going to look at it just yet because I want to get the next pipeline kicked off before we do. In my actions, we should have... But we don't. What have I done wrong? Have I put it in the wrong place? Oh, right. Duh. See, this is what happens when you try and rush. You just do things wrong. Shall we try that one? Thank you. Thank you so much for the help there. OK, so we have our custom domain. We're going to run that one, and we're just going to keep our fingers crossed that it works. If it doesn't, I've got a backup that will do, but I like to see everything working on screen if I can. Last one, 10 minutes. This is going to be touch and go to whether or not it's we get to see it working, but we'll do our best. And that is the actual building of the pipeline. I know I've missed the Apex domain. That's because I can see I'm slightly behind time. If you want, come speak to me afterwards, contact me on Twitter, LinkedIn, whatever, and I'll quite happily discuss it, and I'll put something on a blog post at some point soon. OK, so to make our pipeline, or to do our deploy, first thing we have to do is actually change our application. So inside of my Blazor application, my client, I have this www root folder. And in here, I have a static web app config JSON. As the name suggests, you can update your static web app and control it using this file. You can see I've got root set up in here. I've got my navigation fallback. And I'm going to add a platform. We need this because we are no longer using that automatic build to see what language we're using. So we now have to be in control of saying what language our APIs need to run in. So this is .NET 8. You can see a squiggly line, and that's because the tooling hasn't been updated for .NET 8 yet. Hopefully, Microsoft gets around to that soon. It gives an error in the pipeline, but it does work. So with our application change, we can now hopefully go back to our workflows, and we can make our last workflow, if I can get the name correctly. So let's add one more, our new file, build and deploy app. Now this one is going to look kind of semi-similar to the default one and kind of not. So we are now having an automatic trigger. So if we push to the main branch, we're going to run our deploy. If we are making a pull request, then we're also going to run this job to either make our staging environment or to clean it up. The only change from the default one for the trigger is when we change our infrastructure as code or custom domain, we don't want to rerun this pipeline, so we're going to exclude those. Then we need to build our application, and to be honest, this is just whatever you would normally do when you are building your application. So for me, I'm getting my code, I am setting up .NET 8, testing it, publishing the client, publishing the API, uploading the artifacts to use in my deploy job. If you use Sonar Cloud or whatever other tools you're using, obviously this is the bit that they're going to go in. This is fairly normal. Then we need to do the deploy. So I have a separate job for this so that I can roll back. If I need to go back to a previous version, I can redeploy what was already built. I don't need to build from my repo every time. And this still runs when you are pushing to main or when you're deploying a pull request. And the first thing that we need to do after we have got our artifacts is figure out, are we deploying to production or are we making a staging environment? And we can do that using the event name inside of GitHub. If it's a push, then we know we're pushing to production. If it's not pushed, then we assume that we're in a pull request. And by getting this event number, we can find out the PR number that we're deploying. And we can make a unique environment, staging, and then the PR number, so that we always have a unique name. Then we're logging into Azure again, same as we've done in every pipeline so far. And then we need to get our deploy token. This is something else that if you go through the portal and use the out-of-the-box system, you get a deploy token added to your repo. We don't have that. I can delete that static web app that we just created and recreate it. You never know what your deploy token is. So what we're doing is using the AZ Static Web App to list the secrets, get out the API key, masking it, super important. Do not forget to mask your API key, otherwise your log files are going to be just a little bit of a security leak. And then we're going to make that available for another job. Then we're installing Node. And we're installing Node because we need the Azure Static Web Apps CLI in order to use the deploy. Why Microsoft made the choice to use two tools, I have no idea, but they did, so we kind of just have to live with it. And then when we deploy it, we get our application from the client root. We get our API from the API folder from the artifacts. Use our deploy token that we just extracted. And then finally, we say where we want to deploy it to, our environment. So that's either going to be production or staging 1, staging 2, staging 3, etc. At this point, this pipeline works. I could run this now, and it will make staging environments. It will build to deployment, but it isn't yet giving us a full functionality that we get out of the box, and we want to replicate that. So we want to update our pull request because we want to make it easy for people to test our code. So to do that, we are again using this static web app environment list, the same command we used for our custom domain, only now we want a query for a host name that contains our environment, because that environment name will always exist somewhere in the URL. And then we're using the GitHub REST in order to update our pull request to say, hey, this is deployed to this location, go test it, make sure it's good before you push it to production. One job left, and then I can try and give my voice like a couple of seconds rest while we wait for things to deploy. And that is, we need to clean up. We are making our environments, but we're not cleaning anything up right now, which, like I said at the beginning, it's kind of important to do. So to do that, we now have a job that only runs on a pull request when it's closed, because we only want this to happen when we no longer need the environment, logging into Azure, and then using that static web app environment, we can now delete our staging pull request number environment so that it frees up a slot that we can use for something else. Again, why you have to deploy using the static web app CLI but clean up using the AZ static web app command, I don't know. I am really hoping that they make it a little bit more balanced in the future, but at least you know about it. So now I'm going to try and remember to put in a dot before I type YAML. Go back to, hey, custom domain work, this is good. we are going to kick off. Well, we don't need to kick off. It should automatically kick off if I've not done something stupid, like forgotten to push it. And build. Come on, build. You can do it. Yay, there we go. So now it's building the application. We're just going to quickly make a pull request so that we can show both pipelines working. So PR test, create new branch. And all I want to do is, let's say in my index page, just say, hello, dev. Whoa. See, told you there'd be typos. We are in our PR test, so test. Let's push that one up. We'll publish it. Fingers crossed. And hopefully in a minute, if we go to code, we should now be able to make a pull request. This is good. And first it's going to check it can merge. It takes a couple of seconds, but we should get another pipeline kicked off here. 4 minutes. Now, depending on the speed of Azure, this takes either 3 or 6 minutes to deploy. So fingers crossed that Azure is feeling in a good mood today. Right, while that's deploying, let's take a look at what we've just created, because we now have the static web app with the custom domain. Let's check it's working. Here's my list of resource groups, and there should be one here that we need. So we now have this end demo that wasn't there before. We have an end demo SWA, so this is a static web app we created in the pipeline. We have the end demo URL, so our custom domain has worked. And there's our site waiting for the code to be uploaded. So we have our infrastructure as code and our custom domain working in our pipeline. Just to show you what the normal URL is, and that one stays working because I'm on the free tier, we have blackocean 090bc8403.4.azurestaticapps.net, which, like I say, is probably not something you want to be using every day. Right. For the Dutch people here, het addertje 100 gas. Authentication and authorization. When you are using the free tier, which is what we're using, you have this role management. And I can't use it because we've not finished the first deploy yet, but you invite users from either Microsoft or GitHub. You can assign them roles so that they can use your app with elevated privileges. Has a couple of downsides. Number one is you can only have 50 people in here. That's not 50 people using your app, but 50 people that can have special roles. And number two, when somebody logs into my static web app, they are going to get a user ID generated for them inside of my static web app, which means that if I delete it and recreate it, anything which uses that ID as a key is suddenly an orphan record, and we've basically lost it for all of time, and you can't do anything again. So whilst you can create these users in the pipeline, I wouldn't, I don't. If you're going to be doing this, you're probably going to be using the free tier. You're probably going to have some authentication server available to you, whether that's AAD or identity server or whatever else. Use custom authentication and plug into that, because then you are in control of your user IDs. Super important that you don't remove your static web app and then recreate it and end up with a problem here. Right, how are my deploys doing? I see that one's not done yet. The other one is, okay, Azure's on a slow day. Oh, it's really on a slow day. We've not even got to the deploy yet. We might not get to see this working. I've got like a couple of minutes left. So what I'm going to do is go slightly over time. The Apex domain that I was talking about before, let's quickly discuss that while it finishes. You can set up the Apex domain inside of your pipeline as well. There is a command in a static web app where you can generate a validation token. You put that against your Apex domain in a TXT record, and then you can use that hostname set for your Apex domain. It works. It is incredibly slow, so it's not something I can include in a demo, because it can take upwards of 20 minutes, 40 minutes to run to generate that token, so I don't particularly want to do that in this talk. But it is possible, it can be done. The only reason I don't do it here is time. Okay, we're deploying. That's something at least. We're getting the token. Okay. Right, what I'm going to do is finish off my slides, because I have some thank you slides, and then just before I run off the stage, we'll check to see if it's finished and, hopefully go, woo! So, now that I have been typing away like Kermit, most important slide in the slide deck, I have to thank 3 people whenever I give this talk, and that's Max, Oscar, and Rick, because they gave me invaluable help in the GitHub Actions part of this talk, which was a learning process for me whilst I was doing this. Couldn't have been done without them. I have to shout out to them. Thank you, guys. And then finally, if you go to the QR code, that will take you to a page on my website with lots of links to resources for Azure Static Web Apps, including the book that I wrote a couple of years ago. Don't buy it. I'm currently working on the next version for .NET 9, but it is available. Or buy it and then buy the new one. That one works too, whatever works for yourselves. But yeah, in those resources, you can pretty much find everything I've done here and more things as well. I appreciate this was an absolute whirlwind tour. I apologize for the speed I was talking, but hopefully it's at least giving you the insight that these are real resources and we can use them properly inside of our enterprise environments. Now, before I run off the stage, 6 minutes! You did do those static web apps, didn't you? I'm blaming Twan. It's all his fault. OK, so I don't think that we're going to get to see it deploy, unfortunately. Oh, there it is. Hey, it worked. 25 minutes, and we have it working from inside of a pipeline. Thank you so much for your attention, everybody. I hope you enjoyed this. Hope you've had a great conference. Enjoy the rest of the afternoon.